I wasn't going to tell anyone that I actually was down on the list and wasn't really supposed to be here, but there apparently was a secret email that went out. So my panel knows, but we are going to have a rockin' time. So thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be with all of you. And we heard the panel before was awesome, so we're just going to try to kick some butt up here. But we want to obviously talk about the evolution of sabermetrics in baseball. And I think to do that, it's best to start really where it's most popularly known for starting. And Farhan, if you would talk about how you have seen it evolve a little bit in your time with the Oakland A's, and then getting into how you think competitive advantages are going to evolve.
Sure. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and it's been a theme at this conference. Sports as an industry is getting a lot smarter and a lot more sophisticated in the analysis. So something that would have worked 10 years ago, a lot of that analysis is now really commoditized. And the analogy I was using when we were talking earlier is if you go to an amateur baseball game with a top pitching prospect pitching, and you look behind the plate, every time the guy makes a pitch, you see 30 radar guns go up, 30 different scouts trying to get a reading on that pitch. And, part of you goes, I mean, seriously, guys, can we just get one guy to hold the gun and I'll just share that measurement? But in a lot of ways, that's what sort of the first generation of sabermetric stats really is now. It's 30 teams holding up a radar gun and getting the same reading. So things have really evolved, and we have to be a little more sophisticated in how we go about trying to gain an advantage.
So it's sort of like where on-base percentage back in the day was it. Now you've got to look for that new kind of edge. What do you guys think?
Well, one of my favorite things when you go to scouting to a game and you see all those scouts, not only do you have 30 people holding up the radar gun, as soon as the pitch comes, they start, what did you get? What did you get? Like they're asking each other. So doesn't that even more defeat the purpose of having different radar guns? To me, it's changing daily. I mean, it's just a constantly evolving, changing thing. What analytics to use, we're getting new data all the time. I mean, I know we'll end up talking about that. I just think it's limitless. I mean, I know people keep saying in the earlier panel, Nate Silver, who's 5,000 times smarter than I am, did talk about the idea of diminishing returns at some point, and he was saying we're not really close to there. I don't think we're ever going to get there in baseball. I mean, I just think the game is too complicated and too involved, and I just think analytics are going to keep, they're going to keep growing with the time, and we're going to be measuring things 5 years from now, 10 years from now that right now you would say are impossible to measure, and I think that's pretty cool, pretty exciting.
Well, I'm excited about, I'm almost thinking like on a totally different mindset. I'm thinking about things like sports nutrition. Why isn't anybody quantifying that if you're going in and out all the time, which is awesome and that's great, but maybe there's a better way to do things, and there are certain teams that are starting to do that. They're saying, okay, starting with our prospects, for instance, these guys get a per diem of $20 or whatever. They're making a few $100s a month, and they live 6 people to an apartment or whatever. What if you actually invested in these prospects, some of whom are the future of your franchise, and just put a little more money there instead of wasting, I don't know, let's say $8 million a year on Juan Uribe, for example. So there are ways that you could come up with that you could really enhance the value of your players and your franchise just if you think a little bit differently, these little, just giving them better living conditions. Stuff like that shouldn't be that hard either. The word analytics is so broad, I think it means that too. It means just thinking about things in a different way than you have before and trying to improve them.
And on that note, I would say that, and going back to what we started with here with the 30 radar guns, I would even say even beyond just looking at different data, what's funny is those scouts out there with the 30 radar guns are all going to take that information back to their front offices, and they're all interpreting it a different way, which is amazing to me, really, that everybody's looking at the same information, but everybody gets a different answer out of that. And that's where there's opportunities for a team such as the A's or any team to have a competitive edge if they can interpret the information that they're given better. I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in that regard.
Boris, where do you think the edge is?
I think part of the edge is not forgetting things you've already learned. I think that you can get carried away thinking about what's the next thing, what's the next thing, what's the next thing, and forget about, just because everybody knows on-base percentage is important doesn't mean it's not still important. And I think that is part of it. Part of the edge is not falling behind in the things that you already know. And I think another edge would be not to take all of this gigantic amount of data that's coming in. It's massive. It's unbelievable. And skipping steps. and looking at a stat and then just assuming that it's important. I've seen, at least in soccer, I've seen teams look at a stat that they've just got in from all this new data and run with it before they understood what it actually meant. And I think there's a danger of that happening in terms of fielding, in terms of pitching data that comes in, pitch effects, field effects, these things that come in. I think there's a danger of thinking you know more about a subject just because you have more data. There really needs to be more analysis done on every bit of data you get in so that you know exactly what it means in terms of winning baseball games.
And I think that Boris is the perfect guy to talk about that. He really built this incredible new way to look at the game using stats that are hundreds of years old. I mean, very, very simple statistics, just strikeouts, walks, innings pitched, and completely blew up what everybody kind of thought was true about baseball using very, very simple numbers. So it is so much about how you look at it and not skipping steps and not waiting for whatever the new thing is. I mean, all of that stuff's going to be a part of it too, but there's so much to be learned from what we already know that we don't know.
Well, and the logical progression from Voris's theory, from the DIPS theory is, okay, so if defense makes such a big difference, then why don't we invest in defense? And I thought there was a very interesting article Dave Schoenfield wrote for ESPN.com just a day or two ago, and he was comparing Brendan Ryan in 2012 to Prince Fielder, his 50 home run season a few years ago. This gets into differences of what is WAR on this website versus this website. There's a lot of stuff that we could talk about, but the point is Brendan Ryan is this 155-pound guy who's a marvelous fielder, and like Paz might be a better hitter than Brandon Ryan, for example. So it's just, no offense. And so,
No offense.
Right. fair. And so he's got all this value just because he plays that position, he plays it so well that it's like you can almost start to equate this guy to a perennial all-star, to somebody who maybe could be a future Hall of Famer. And I think there's such a big disconnect. Like, how could Brendan Ryan be worth anything close to Prince Fielder that we still haven't wrapped our brains around, even though the Baseball Prospectus article came out. Let me see if I can get this. Is it January 15th, 2001?
Well, January 2001 was as close as I was going to
I
be
think
able to
that
come.
might be right, actually. It was a very influential article is what I'm telling you. So.
But what's amazing is that 10 years ago, we wouldn't even be talking about Brendan Ryan like this. We would be making fun of him because he has no value.
Right.
In 10 years, we didn't understand, 10 years ago, even using the same information we were collecting then, we didn't understand his value to a major league team. And the kind of sabermetric community would criticize him a lot. And it was, we've learned from that data, going back to your point a minute ago.
And I think to a certain extent, I'm not sure we still know well what his value is. I mean, we have a fairly broad range. We know that he's a fantastic defensive shortstop, but we don't know in terms of, there's an error bar there. There's a large error bar there into just how valuable he is with that. And I think that's another one of those things with skipping steps that I've seen with the defensive metrics is that they're very valuable. It's great to have them, but we shouldn't, set the numbers they say in stone. I think that there are real significant criticisms that can be made towards the fielding metrics that go into something like WAR. I think those criticisms are valid. I don't think we do ourselves any favor if we try and brush off criticisms of a number just because we're using that number a lot. And so I think that's a big thing, is that to not get out ahead of how much we think we know. I mean, Darwin Barney last year, for like the first half of last year, the defensive metrics basically said that Darwin Barney was far and away the greatest defensive second baseman of all time. And that's possible. It's possible he is the greatest defensive second baseman of all time. More likely, there was something wrong or missing or not accurate in the statistics that were being kept that took a very, very good defensive second baseman and turned him into, a guy who's better than Bill Mazeroski and things like that. And so I think we have to be on guard not to defend something just because we believe that it's important and it's part of the process.
Boris, what did you glean from your time with the Red Sox?
Lots of things.
Because we talked about that earlier, and I think you
yeah.
had some interesting perspective.
Well, I worked for them from October 2002 through the draft in July 2005, and I learned a lot of things, particularly coming in from a very, amateur background. I mean, this was not something that I was planning on doing with my life when it happened. And you learn quickly that baseball is a game that a lot of people want to be involved in, and everybody wants their voice heard in the front office. Everybody wants their voice heard. Everybody deserves to have their voice heard. And so you have to provide value to a team. It's what you have to do, and sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do when you're one vote and everybody else is 17, 18 votes. And so one of the things I learned about working for a major league team is not to personalize what goes on. In some respects, you're a cog in a machine. It's your job to provide what it is they're paying you to provide them, and then they either use it or they don't, and not to get too wrapped up in, well, they didn't draft this guy or they didn't sign this guy. You can't really go about thinking about things in that fashion because it'll drive you nuts. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that. I can totally appreciate that dynamic. Working with the A's, we have a smaller front office, which we think works really well, and that's something that Billy has always wanted to prioritize. But I, like everybody in this room, I'm very passionate about what I do. I'm very passionate about baseball and our team and the decisions that we make. And there are times when I get almost too passionate, and when those times come, Billy, sort of half-jokingly starts, calling me the emotional stat guy. Because, the way he tries to hand-check me a little bit when things are getting overheated. But, it is interesting that, you've had this dichotomy in baseball between sort of this more traditional scouting side and the analytical side. I think you can be just as passionate about your viewpoints and the ideas that you develop using objective data, even though the foundation of it is objective, but you can have the same conviction in your beliefs.
How much has that changed for you, though? I mean, how much less emotional stat guy do you have to become because of time that's passed and how it's evolved?
Well, I try to embrace that. I mean, I'm planning on that being, my fantasy football team name in our office league next year, the Emotional Stat Guys. But I mean, you just have to balance everything. And, for the general manager who's sitting at the, head of the table and ultimately has to make the decision, I mean, these baseball decisions are so complex. There's so many different areas where you're getting information from and data from. And, there's this idea that, the moves that we make are the moves that the sort of organization has condoned. And a lot of times, you don't see what's going on behind the scenes. There's oftentimes a lot of disagreement, even about some of the major moves that we make. And, at the end of the day, we come to a conclusion. Billy has to decide on something, and that's what we go with. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a ton of different viewpoints. And, this idea that there's an organizational philosophy, sometimes it undermines the fact that there are a lot of different individuals, that they have a lot of different opinions, and that what winds up being the output of transactions that a team has is really a conglomeration of a lot of different opinions and the judgment of the person that makes the ultimate call.
I have a follow-up for Farhan, actually. This is something that I've been looking at recently, and I've been talking offline to a guy named Russell Carlton, who writes for Baseball Prospectus and is a great researcher, and we've been trying to get our arms around the idea of roster construction. So if you think about the teams that have the most money, for all intents and purposes, they build, I guess in fantasy you'd call it a stars and scrubs roster. You have all these guys who make $15 million, and okay, we're going to get scrubs to fill out the rest of the roster. And the 2012 A's had so much depth and balance. And again, if you want to use WAR, there were no 5-win players on the A's. Everybody was, I think Josh Reddick might have had 4.8 or something like that. And I'm curious if you could physically build a team like that by design, or if it worked out that way because you traded Cahill and Gio Gonzalez and just created depth,
right.
Or like if you are a low revenue franchise, I know Tampa Bay's done this a little bit too, do you just say 1 through 25 has to really matter? Or let's say you had a $200 million payroll,
Yeah.
Would you change it up and just say, okay, we're going to take Cano, we're going to do this, or we're going to build a team that way? What's
Right.
the optimal way to go?
As we say around the office, we're never going to turn down a superstar player if you're going to hand him over to us.
Right.
So,
The Red Sox did.
yeah, exactly. So star players are good. Let's get that out of the way. But, that was a very sort of active part of our strategy last year, and we even sort of had a term for it around the office. We called it sort of managing the roster from the bottom, because when you're a team that is, this is something that we've talked about a lot. when you're a team that's pretty sabermetrically inclined and analytical in the decisions you make, if you follow those decisions, there's really a lower bound, I think, to how many wins. You can build a 75-win team just based on sort of sound analytical principles, and you can do that year in, year out, even with a $50 million payroll. The question is, how do you get beyond that point? One way is to add at the top of the roster with stars, which for us just isn't an affordable strategy. And the other way is to manage from the bottom and take players that are liabilities, even small liabilities, and say, what does it do to the collective team at the end of 162 games if we can shave some of this off the bottom in terms of the productivity? So, whether it's a backup catcher or utility infielder or, the 9th or 10th bullpen arm that you have that'll be up and down all year, really optimizing those positions for us became an important part about building a competitive team. So I think that's a really sort of astute observation that, for teams with our situation, us, Tampa, teams like that, you're not going to turn down a star player. I think the Rays are very happy to have Longoria and Price and guys like that. But you get to a certain point. What's that?
Not for much longer. Go ahead.
Yeah, but when you are trying to make continued increments, that's the direction you have to go in.
Where do you guys see the focus shifting in terms of baseball analytics?
I would say that I think it's kind of an evolving industry at this point. In baseball, we've had the benefit of Bill James and Project Scoresheet and StatsInc and a lot of RetroSheet, a lot of publicly available data. We're starting to see that the new sort of more of the cutting edge is on new sources of data, which aren't necessarily publicly available. More and more teams are getting involved in this kind of analysis, although still not all of them. And they're keeping it more in-house. I think we're seeing it a little bit more privatized than out in the public forum, in the public domain. And I think that has some interesting implications for just where it goes from there. I think we're not going to necessarily hear about the greatest. Maybe Farhan's got like all the secrets back at the office, and he's the smartest one on the panel and knows all the secrets, and we're never going to know that.
That's not true. I can tell you that.
I think another the implications of that, they're not all positive, I don't think. I think the openness of Bill James and all this open information, I think that led to growth in the discoveries. Having it open for everybody to look at, the more people who look at something, the more likely it is somebody's going to find something. So this proprietary model, which is needed this data now, it costs significant amounts of money to generate it. So it needs to be proprietary, but the downside of that is I think that the growth of knowledge will be slightly slower because it is proprietary and it's in so few hands. There is the downside of that. I think that we're moving more towards a baseball modeling situation where you're not really even thinking about things like home runs and walks anymore. You're thinking about getting more to the baseline of this guy is a human being as a player. What is his skills? What are his abilities? And how does that affect us winning baseball games? And with the computer modeling and the video that we have available now, that no longer has to just involve going to walks and strikeouts and these things. You can bring in this new data. And so I think that's the next direction is video data analysis, not just in fielding, but in pitching, even in hitting eventually. I think when you get all of that new data in and people start to really dig into it, I think you're going to see a big explosion in what's available there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joe.
No, I think that's right. I think that it's all heading in the direction of people are going to be, there's so many ways now you can measure a pitcher's movement. There's so many ways you can measure the speed of a ground ball. There's so many ways you can measure the height of a fly ball. And you're going to be able to figure out all kinds of things using that new data. But I think that Forrest's earlier line about this is really important. I think that there are going to be all sorts of new ways to look at this, but it's going to be very, very easy to forget what this has been built up on. Forrest said earlier, everybody knows on-base percentage is important. I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm around the game. I don't think that's true.
You're around the Kansas City Royals.
Well, as just an example, the Kansas City
Temperature
Royals.
dropped a little in here.
Yeah, yeah.
Apologies if you work for the Kansas City Royals, by the way.
Yeah, I think Boris made a great point, and this is something that we're trying to emphasize in our front office, and obviously others are doing the same. To really make the analysis more about skills and not outcomes. And we were talking earlier, and I said, hitting 300 isn't a skill; it's an outcome. The skill is making consistently solid
Whatever
contact.
that player's hitting abilities generate that outcome, and two different players with two different hitting abilities can hit 300. They can hit the same thing,
Right.
Because it's just an outcome. What you're looking for is the underlying abilities that affect the numbers that we look at in the box scores every day.
Right. And what's interesting at a conference like this is, baseball has such a long history of statistics. I think we're very fixated on outcomes, maybe more than in other sports. And when the sort of analytical wave really started taking off in basketball and some other sports, I don't think they were tied down to outcomes the way that we tend to be. So, a lot of the basketball systems that are coming online now, teams are trying to measure how good players are at the pick and roll, how good players are at moving without the ball. They're not looking at who scores points, who rebounds, who passes the ball. And, in baseball, we have to start moving away and not forgetting that ultimately getting hits and scoring runs is what matters.
Right.
But, really measuring, as a front office that's trying to put together the best possible team, we want the most skilled players. We don't want the guys that put up the best numbers last year.
How do those things, those numbers and those, the methods by which you judge them, how do they impact the players when it comes contract time? How does that work with agents? I think that's very interesting.
Well, I always say players like the stats that make them
Right.
look good. Jack Cost was a big proponent of on-base percentage, as you can imagine. I still remember that very vividly. They want to know what it says about them before they tell you what they think of the stat. So I think I would probably do the same thing. There's a range of guys. I think there are guys for whom looking at those numbers can meaningfully impact the way they approach the game and improve things for them. Mm-hmm. And there are guys who would just as soon just ignore that stuff and go about their business. It's whatever sort of works for them. So we don't have really strict guidelines of what numbers we want guys to look at and, a process for them. We have to remember that these are human beings and, every one of them is different. And, we just want them to do what they're most comfortable doing.
But I would say this, and one thing I'd love to hear everybody talk about, we're talking about analyzing the game, but statistics specifically can change the entire game. And I use the example of saves, and I think about this all the time. The save changed baseball more than baseball was measured by the save. Basically, because of the save, we have one-inning closers who get paid a lot of money because of the save. We figured out a way to quantify finishing a game that your team was already leading going into the ninth inning became a statistic. We counted those statistics. We started measuring it. Somebody who had 30 saves was a good player, got paid more. Somebody got 40 saves, a better player, got paid even more. And the number itself actually changed the game. The number might be a horrible statistic. I actually think it is a pretty bad statistic. But it was the save itself that changed baseball. So you were talking about how does it affect the players. Players love the save if you are a reliever because you're getting paid a lot more money because of the save. I think that to me is where it gets very, very interesting. I think that the analytics that Oakland does, for example, is skill-based and it's much more focused on building a team and trying to build the kind of team that will score a lot of runs, prevent runs, and that sort of thing. But the public stats that we have a very, very direct impact, I think, on the game as we watch it. Right. And I think that's going to continue. I think the home runs, the RBIs have affected the game for 100 years. The people realize you get paid more if you have a lot more RBIs, so you try to drive in a lot of RBIs. So that to me is, I think, very, very interesting, and it's like a very, very separate mission from, I think, what we're talking about here, which is inside the game and how do you get a better team and how do you build a better team. This, to me, affects the entire game, and I think we're going to have new stats that are going to affect the game in that way, that are going to get players. If we find out that there's a way to determine, a way that becomes publicly accepted, that Brendan Ryan is as good as Prince Fielder, then guys like Brendan Ryan we're going to have more of them, and they're going to get paid a lot of money.
Well, but this is the beauty part of all this is you talk about it absolutely affects the game, RBI and saves and stuff. But teams don't have to play by those rules. So
They don't.
Oakland's closer is Grant Balfour. He's making $4 million a year. He's really a good player, a very good pitcher, and he's not getting paid that much. The Rays paid Fernando Rodney 10 cents, and he had one of the 10 best seasons ever for a closer. You can either decide you want to play by those rules or not. And the teams that, now if you have a $200 million payroll, I'm not saying there's nothing to a closer mentality. It certainly is the case that there are guys who perform better in some situations. Fine. And there are pitchers who are qualitatively better. That's fine. I don't think Jonathan Papelbon's contract is a great contract, but Jonathan Papelbon is a really good pitcher. And if you're the Phillies, you have a $160 million payroll, fine. But you don't have to do that, and Kansas City doesn't, and Tampa Bay doesn't. And it creates, I mean, it goes back to, this is 11 years since Moneyball, but it is a market inefficiency. And you either say, I'm in on this, or I'm not in on this, and you figure out other ways to build it. So, yeah, maybe Brendan Ryan will never get the $15 million contract. Farhan doesn't have a problem with that. That's great for him. I mean, that means that he can do different things that other teams can't.
I mean, it goes a little bit to what Voros was saying earlier, though, about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, the fact is, the average save situation, that inning, is higher leverage than the average relief. I mean, it means something.
Sure.
And I think sometimes, as a community, sort of the saber can almost overshoot with new findings and kind of take things too far in the other direction. When you have a save, it's generally a fairly high leverage situation that had more value than the average relief inning. But to your point, Joe, not only does it change how players are paid, but it changes how managers manage. And that is actually an area of analytics where I think, we can continue to make progress really in the game, not just managerial decisions and coaching decisions, but even advanced reporting. I mean, we saw this with Tampa and Toronto last year, the amount of defensive shifting that they did. They took it to a completely different level. And, the game could look really different if the amount of progress we've made in terms of just player evaluation spreads into the other areas of the game.
The problem with that, I mean, he's absolutely right, but the difficulty is that this is not a particularly progressive sport. And when my first year in Boston, we spent most of our off-season money on, position players. We had a bunch of holes to fill. We had a hole at first, a hole at third, a hole at second. And we had all these positions we needed to fill. And, at the time, our budget wasn't huge. I mean, it was big, but it wasn't, huge Yankee-style sort of thing. And so we were out of money once we filled all those positions, and we still had a bullpen to build. And, they just hired Bill, and we were going to go and do this sort of leveraged-based bullpen where, our best relievers were going to pitch not necessarily in save situations, but in the most important situations in the game. And it's a great idea. It's a fine idea. The problem is that when this is your plan and you blow a save on opening day, it becomes next to impossible to stick with the plan because people, the press flips out, everybody flips out. And it actually wound up hurting us the whole year. Even after the narrative was set for the whole year that we were doing a closer by committee because we had a lousy bullpen and our bullpen was terrible and our bullpen was terrible. And our bullpen wasn't great. But by the end of the year, we had added so many relievers because we kept getting, we have to trade for a reliever. By the end of the year, our bullpen was pretty good. We had added Scott Williamson, we had Young-Hung Kim, Timlin was pitching well, and our bullpen was pretty good. And yet we got into the playoffs, and that narrative was still there. The Red Sox, they can't go to their bullpen. Their starters need to go 7, 8 innings so that to stay away from the bullpen. Even though and Williamson was unhittable in the playoffs. Every time he came in, he either walked the guy or he struck him out. And so we shouldn't have been afraid of it. But just that from that opening thing, baseball managers, baseball teams, everyone wants to do well, but they also want to avoid risk. There's a saying I used to say is that if you play a star veteran player, if you're a manager and you play a star veteran player and he's terrible, it's the star player's fault. If you play an untested rookie and he's terrible, it's your fault.
Yeah.
And so people want to avoid risk, and I think making a major change like in bullpen construction involves risk if it doesn't work out the way you hope.
And that gets into the outcome-based thing that we were talking about earlier. There probably are managers and teams who would like to go to a 4-man rotation, as just an example. Might think that might be a better 4-man rotation, have them pitch fewer innings per outing, but maybe you'd want to go that. First pitcher to get hurt, ruins it forever. You'll never be able to, and pitchers get hurt all the time. It might have nothing to do with the four-man rotation, but everybody knows, and it's about risk, but it's also about outcome. And the thing about when you're trying to build a team is you've got to look at this huge picture, and you've got to be thinking so far in advance and how it's going to work and how things are going to over a full season, over 5 seasons, over 10 seasons. But all the outcome cares about is tonight's game. And if you think, okay, we're playing this 19-year-old kid at shortstop, and we're going to try him out, we're going to play him, and he's going to be great. We figure he's going to be good to this point, and then he's going to get a little better, and then he's going to get a little better, and we're going to build him up. And you've got this whole long plan, and that night he goes 0 for 5 and makes 3 errors, and everybody starts booing him from that point on. It changes everything. So I mean, it really is. I think that to me is where the clash is. Everybody talks about the clash between scouting and sort of objective analysis. I don't think the clash is as big there. I think the clash is between really trying to build something and then the daily outcome that kind of pours on. And I bet that's why Billy doesn't go to games, right? I mean, Billy doesn't want to let that daily outcome affect him as much.
Well, and this goes to the to me, the single most important ingredient to building a successful sport franchise is to have a great owner. The owner is the one who's going to pay LeBron James, but it's beyond that. The owner is the one who hires the team president. The team president is going to say, okay, I'm going to hire a general manager who's not going to give a fig about any implications. The closer blew the save, I don't care. The star player broke the, I don't care. I'm not interested in the media. I could not care less. And we're just doing it our way, and we're not going to worry about outside pressure. The general manager, who was hired by the team president, who was hired by the owner, hires the manager. And the manager can instill these things in the players. And there are very few teams in any sport that I think really do this. They just give 0 Fs about it at all. They're just like, we're doing it this way, and that's it. I don't care. Yeah. And I think that that's a huge inefficiency to be exploited, and it goes to all the way to the top. So Mark Cuban spoke before. I think that he has that mindset. He obviously has the resources to finance his team, but he also has that kind of giving 0 Fs mentality. He's just like, okay, we're going to do this, and I'm going to hire this guy and this guy and this guy. And everyone down the line, all the way to the assistant coaches, are bought into that system. That is a great way to run a franchise. I think that you could do huge things that way.
It's like the Nationals shutting down Strasburg.
Yes,
but an entirely different
Is that
debate.
your yes, I agree face, Jonah?
Yeah, sort of.
I think that's, for us in Oakland, I think we have a little bit of that, with as ingrained as Billy is in that, organization and franchise. And, Jonah, you've written about this too. With your smaller mid-market team, you have to engage in what you've called the high variance strategy. And that's what we have to do. I mean, if we just do what every other team is doing, we will play to our payroll, and that will be a totally meaningless existence for us. So, when you engage in a high variance strategy, you're going to do things that don't work, and you're going to make trades that are, that really don't work out for you. And you need a general manager in place who's not afraid to make that trade. And I think a lot of smaller middle market teams that don't have that stability in their front office, in any sport really, it sort of undermines the optimal strategy for those teams, which is to take risks. Because if you're a small market team and you're just hoping that you can do everything and evaluate players and do advanced reports and everything just better than everything else, that's a losing strategy. And it's even all the more important for us. I 100% agree with that.
It does change, however, you're talking about Oakland or Tampa or Kansas City. I could tell you that the Boston Globe is a whole nother thing in terms of Red Sox coverage. When something goes wrong for the Boston Red Sox, it's not the easiest thing in the world to ignore the press as they hammer and hammer and hammer and hammer and hammer away. And it's a hard thing. We're human beings. If thousands of people are calling for your head, it's not the easiest thing in the world. You say, yeah, screw them. It's not easy. And so, yeah, ultimately, Jonah's right. I mean, it is, the most efficient, the best way, to run a franchise. It's just in practice, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do.
But practically speaking, would that affect your revenue stream? Like if you just have the Boston media hammering you, Fenway still sells out every game. People are still watching Ness and are people really going to, I have no interest in the Red Sox because...
No, they're just going to have no interest in you continuing to work for the Red Sox if you're the general manager and every day there's 5 articles about what a terrible job you're doing.
Right, but if there's no tangible financial effect on the franchise, then you just need to hire a cyborg general manager who just has no emotions whatsoever and says, okay, fine, I don't care, keep doing it, it's fine.
Well,
Robot? We just need robot general managers.
Robot
Yeah.
general managers, that's the lesson of the day today.
I'll tell you what, though, all the, coaches, managers, and general managers who say they don't read the clips or the, stuff in the media, those are just the guys who have the best hiding places for when they do read that stuff. I mean, you can't avoid it in this day and age. So, and I think you're right, Morris. It does sort of affect your mentality. You have to work hard to still do what you believe is the right thing.
And I thought Michael Lewis, when he wrote that in Moneyball, made the great point. I mean, if you can ignore everything, what's the fun of being in baseball if you're ignoring? I mean, then you're just in a business, right? I mean, if you're just completely not, able to walk around Boston and hang out with, and high five people as they're walking by, if they're booing you and kicking stuff at you, every time you go, yeah, it wouldn't be a lot of fun. There is intense pressure. Obviously, you can't completely fall to that pressure no matter who you are. I mean, you can't let the fans run the team, can't let the press run the team, although I try. But you can't let that happen. But by the same token, to completely avoid it and completely push it out and completely ignore everything, it's kind of implausible. I mean, I don't think very many people could do that.
A good example of the way this directly affects what goes on in terms of player management is at the trade deadline every year, the contending teams, they almost all make at least one trade. And that is not so much because there's always one guy that's going to help make that team better. It's if they don't make one trade, when the trade deadline passes, they get to read in the paper the next day that, they're not even trying to win because they're not trying to add players. But I mean, in reality, they could have looked at what was out there and said, we like what we already have. But almost everybody has to make one or two trades at the trade deadline just to demonstrate that they're trying to win games. And that's the pressure coming from the media of making you do something that you might normally wouldn't want to do. I mean, in that season, we added 4 relievers in the span of a month in the middle of the season, trying to add more and more and more relief pitching to the team because everyone kept screaming, you need more relief pitching.
The Rays are a great example of navigating that. I mean, the A's, and as Jonah knows, the Rays firsthand are great examples of those front offices that can navigate those waters more efficiently. I think we're seeing, in recent times, we've seen the Rays with the shift. It's very against the grain, but it's worked for them, right? And they've been successful. They've made the playoffs, and everybody knows their story now. Everybody else is starting to copy them. And that's a great example of some of the things that we're talking about of looking at. You can't remember the one time where the shift gets beaten by the ground ball that goes the other way. You've got to remember the 5 times that you saved a base hit. As more and more research comes out there, we've done some of this in our books and our publications, and it supports the evidence of that. You've got to go with it, even if it doesn't work every time, even if your pitchers aren't necessarily on board with it. You've got to have everyone from the owner on down on the same page and committed to that process.
Do you guys see sports writers, and you guys can answer this, steering towards or away from sabermetrics? And where do you think its place is in media?
Joe?
Me?
Joe?
People are it is very divisive in media. I think more so than in the game. I mean, you hear about it all the time in the game. I think the game, in many ways, there's been a peace kind of building between scouting and some of the so subjective kind of things of all the radar guns and I'm not saying it's harmony, but there's those, they've been at it longer. I think in the media it's different. There are a couple of challenges, especially on the broadcast side, but in writing as well, with writing about advanced statistics and all that. If I write tomorrow about Zach Greinke, and I write Zach Greinke won 16 games last year, everybody understands that. If I say Zach Greinke's FIP was whatever it was, you got to have a whole other paragraph explaining what FIP is and explaining this and that and the other. So it's a different language that you have to kind of teach people. Some people are very into that. I'm very into that. Jonah's very into that. A lot of there are a lot of younger writers really that are very into that because they know that the fact that Zach Greinke won 16 games last year doesn't mean a whole lot. They know that they can tell you a little bit more about Zach Greinke through these other forms of analysis. There is a substantial number, though, that are very much away from that. And obviously, the biggest example of this was last year at the end of the year when we had the MVP, between, with Mike Trout and Miguel Cabrera. And you really saw very steep divide. I mean, there was a very, very steep divide between what became known as sort of mainstream media and sort of the internet type writers. But I don't think it was that. I think there was just a big divide on what kind of role this kind of analysis plays in writing, in baseball writing and baseball journalism. But the reality is that it's getting younger. There are a lot more people coming into it than are going out. You know, and it's going to be a much younger game, and this next generation and the next generation after that are going to be much more analytical. But I think right now we have a divide.
And I think that emphasizes one of your points from earlier, Joe, about the save statistic and about which statistics we use to communicate, you know, with the media and the guys coming up with the statistics as well, to make sure that we're providing sufficient statistics, accurate enough statistics that give that picture in the best way possible, that are intuitive enough that the sports writers and then therefore the public and the fans can interpret them and use them without fear of using an irresponsible number, a number that's not accurate enough. You know, talking about what Voris was saying about defensive statistics and Darwin Barney as a company that has defensive statistics that strongly support. You know, we're getting better at coming to the source and the skill behind that, and we understand why he rates so well now. We can break that down a little bit better. That's new data that's been developed, and we can break that. And Joe, I know you're a voter on the Fielding Bible Awards. Obviously, that we gave the Fielding Bible Award to Darwin Barney last year. I think we understand that better, and we feel more comfortable with him now. But we're not there yet all the way.
Well, and it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, it's 100 years of error talk when it comes to fielding, right? It's 100 years of RBIs. It's 100 years of batting average. So, you know, even something to me, I watch on-base percentage very closely as sort of a marker. How many people use on-base percentage in writing? Because on-base percentage is a very, very easy stat to understand. I think even people that don't like talking about advanced statistics would probably agree that on-base percentage is a better teller of how good a player is than batting average. I think everybody can see it relates better to wins and losses than batting average does. So I think in general people would agree on-base percentage is better. You still see batting average a lot more than you see on base percentage. A lot of that is just inertia. I mean, it's just, you know, this is the way it's been for a long time, and I think it's going to take time to change. But I'd be interested to hear what Jonah thinks on this. It is going to change. It is changing now, and it's going to keep changing because, as I said, more and more people, I mean, a lot of the people here in the audience grew up. I mean, when I was a kid, we had 3 stats, hitting stats. That's it. We had batting average, we had home runs, we had RBIs. I didn't know how many runs anybody scored. I didn't know how many doubles anybody hit. Certainly never heard of anything like on base percentage. It was 3 stats. Obviously now people are growing up in a much different world.
Well, and to Joe's point about message, I had a cubicle life back in the day. I used to work in a cubicle, and I didn't have a lot of clutter in my cubicle, but I had one thing that I tacked up on the board, and it was a quote from Bill James, and I can't remember the exact quote, but the gist of it was, do not write for the lowest common denominator. Flatter your reader, engage your reader, and challenge your reader. Say, you know what, this other stuff is not good enough. We have to do better than that. And I find that just whenever a subject gets dumbed down, we're not doing anybody any favors. People are smart. Your audience is smart. Engage them and make them think about things in a little bit of a different way. There's a way to talk about FIP in a way that's not going to alienate people. You're not going to come off as the wise ass and I know more than you, but you're kind of meeting halfway. And I find that that's the case with other fields too. And this is a little bit of an out there example, but like NBC, for instance, okay? So on their, they have this lineup of Thursday night comedies, and they were funny, they were good. And they're like, we don't really care for that. We're gonna do the most mainstream stuff possible. 30 Rock is too esoteric. Parks and Rec is too smart. I don't want any of that stuff. Just give me the laugh track and the and that's it, and we're gonna be done with it. That's horrible. That really it diminishes the quality of the product. And I think that Joe and myself and anybody who does what we do, we have a responsibility to put out Parks and Rec style content. It has to be engaging, entertaining, and it has to be intelligent. That is what our role should be.
And I suppose we're in that boat too.
I work at NBC.
Right, I was going to say, Joe,
I didn't know that.
Joe,
yet.
just-
you need to take
as
Jonah's
a thing.
criticisms and bring them back to your boss so that they can adjust their Thursday night schedule.
If we're going to have a war right here, I'll take off the jacket. We'll go right now.
Let's go right now.
Boros, how did you convince folks with dips? How did you
I
convince
have the
them to
slightest
listen?
idea. It would persistence, just over and over and over again. people would just argue with you and argue with you and argue. Quite frankly, if it happened today, if I came up with it today, I'm too old to be able to do it again. It's the thing that only someone in their 20s can do, be that persistent about an idea and shove it down people's throats, whether they want it or not. You just had to keep going and going and going. The value that I had was the people that I was discussing with this as a group, a rec sport baseball internet group sort of thing. They were more open-minded than I think the average baseball fan would be, and so they didn't just dismiss it right out of hand. And so people would look up for themselves, and eventually some people would say, I think he might be onto something here. And it's just persistence. I mean, to be honest, by 2005, I was done working for the Red Sox, and it was still, 60% against 40% for my side. And it wasn't until the last couple of years where it just finally is, coalesced around this idea that there definitely is something there with it. And it's hard. It's hard work convincing someone of an idea, particularly an out of left field idea like that. It's hard work, and you just have to keep doing it over and over and over again. As long as you have confidence that you're right, you just have to be persistent with it.
We have some folks that have sent in some questions, so I'm going to go down a couple of these. The first one is, how can we apply what we already know to evaluating younger talent? Is it any different than analyzing players already in the show? Farhan?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this early, and I said the question of how good players are, we have a pretty good a handle on. The question of how good players can be or might be in the future is something that we're still figuring out. And a lot of times we're applying the same analysis, to the question of how good is this player to how good a player can be. And there's so many areas where, the knowledge in baseball and frankly in other sports is limited. Some of the other discussions around here have talked about mental aptitude, which is an area that, there are certain success-oriented behaviors that I think we feel anecdotally we've seen, but the actual objective studies that show, players with these kinds of traits or with this kind of test, if you score like this, you're more likely. I mean, it's really hard to make it through the minors up to the major leagues. It's a huge grind. The longer I've been in this game, the more respect I have for guys that make it all the way up the ladder. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult and arduous journey, and, it's not for everybody, even guys that are incredibly talented. So that's really an area that we need to do a lot more work on. And you see, in evaluating prospects, something that's been very common is the idea of major league equivalence. This guy hit 300 in A ball. That's like hitting 260 in the big leagues. Well, the question isn't what does his minor league line translate to in the big leagues. The question is which guys are going to outperform that number and which guys are going to underperform that number. And that's really the question that's facing us now. And it's a lot more complicated than just a simple, translation.
Don't you think it's a little bit more complicated in baseball, too? I mean, Mark Cuban was up here talking about how different basketball is, that in general, nobody just comes out of nowhere in the NBA. I mean, there are surprises or whatever, but the best players in the game are generally the players that you thought were going to be the best players in the game. Albert Pujols was the 375th pick in the draft, right? The 13th round of the draft. And 2 years later, he had one of the greatest rookie seasons in baseball history. And 4 years later, he's the best player in the game. So I don't know what it is about baseball that allows that. That could never happen in another sport. I mean, maybe in football could. Tom Brady, I guess, was a very late pick. And so maybe it could happen in other sports to some degree. But it seems like baseball is the one place where, if you want to talk about inefficiencies, that seems like there are more opportunities in baseball to find these kinds of hidden gems if you knew where to look.
Absolutely, and the volume. I mean, we have a 40-round draft. I mean, that's enormous compared to the other sports. Just the volume of players, and the Pujols example is a good one. We have Dan Straley, a kid who we drafted very late in the draft, who had a terrific year in the minors and was with us in the big leagues at the end of the season. And our scouting staff deserves a lot of credit for taking him, but he probably should have gone 20 rounds earlier. So. I think the volume and the amount of uncertainty that you're dealing with, I mean, it's still, an area where there's a ton of work to be done, and it's less defined than this guy was worth 8 wins. We know that, and we can get our hands around that a lot better than the question of what these guys coming up are going to do.
And there's more development time in baseball than in other sports too. There's a big gap between when a guy gets drafted out of high school or college and when he's going to be an impact player in the major leagues. In basketball, I mean, plenty of guys have gone from high school, although they can't do that anymore. They're going to contribute immediately when they're going to start every day. Baseball players just don't do that. They don't peak as early. They need time in the minors. Even the better ones, the Evan Longorias who progress through the minor leagues at breakneck pace, they take 2 years to get there before they're ready to contribute on a daily basis. I think that there's time for things to happen, for them to improve their training regimen, or for them to, if they have a poor work ethic, for that to come out. If they looked great in high school and they just don't have the mental capacity or the right attitude about improving themselves, there's time for that to break down before they're going to contribute at the big leagues.
This is an interesting question. How does an organization balance protecting proprietary information with generating new ideas from the outside?
Well, you probably protect proprietary information by not coming to big conferences and getting on stage. So,
Oh, we're all friends.
it's a good question. One of the phrases we've talked a lot about is competitive advantage, and I kind of shy away from using that phrase because I think it's a little bit presumptuous to assume that what you're doing is better than everybody else. But I think what's important to us in our process is competitive differentiation. I mean, we want to know that what we're doing is somehow different, that our evaluation process is somehow different. It's going to identify some players that we wind up being right about, like a guy like Josh Reddick, who we thought was going to be an everyday player that a lot of other people thought was going to be a fourth outfielder, and he had a terrific season for us last year. And sometimes it's going to be wrong, and people are going to think, why did they get that player? And people are going to be right about it, But we just have to sort of, approach it, from that point of view. And that's where our proprietary stuff comes in. But at the same time, you have to be open to developments like DIPS, which was for pretty much every team, a development that came from outside. And you have to ask yourself, is this a better way of evaluating players than what we're doing? And that's ultimately an objective question that I think teams that are balanced in their evaluation can sort of process and integrate.
Well, and I'm interested in the evolution of how the data works in basketball, and this has been talked about at this conference before. Daryl's brought it up, and other people. Hoop data and 82 games, there were certain sites, like Ken Pomeroy's been doing it forever, but there weren't that many people who were doing really cutting edge stuff from the get-go. The analytics, the good analytics in basketball kind of came about privately first. Baseball was all open source. It was the original people at Baseball Prospectus. And so, I mean, going back even further than that, and it just, okay, teams figured it out and they went that way, and that was the progression. Now basketball is almost backwards, where it started privately and now you've got 45 geniuses on the True Hoop Network who are all doing this really cool stuff publicly, and they're figuring it out on their own. You know what I mean? So it's funny the way things can progress, where you think, okay, well, it's always going to be behind closed doors or whatever, but there are just so many smart people coming out of schools like this, and they figure it out, and they have their own initiative, and they say, this is what it's going to be, and this is the next analytical wave, and that's fine. But the funny thing, of course, is that those people inevitably get hired by the teams, and they try to privatize it more and more. So it's like a race to see how fast the teams can quash the information that the really smart 23-year-old graduate of MIT just came out with. That's pretty much what it is.
Speaking of graduates, and this is interesting for all of you out there, I would like to hear an answer, but for the students that are out there in the crowd, are there any opportunities for MBAs or PhDs that are looking, for those folks that are looking to get into sports, anything that you guys could suggest?
I mean, I have a BA in journalism. They're way more qualified than I. That's a whole Ben should answer that question.
I failed out of accounting. I think we should focus really probably
that's
on
fine.
in baseball. You don't need an MBA to do what we're doing.
I'm of the opinion that not just for baseball, for virtually every big job out there that there is, baseball or a doctor or whatever, there's really only so much you can learn in school until you're going to learn most of what you really need to know about the job by doing the job. So I'm not sure MBAs and PhDs are necessarily the sort of thing that's going to be necessary for, to get involved in a baseball. I mean, talking at MIT, but I don't think it's necessarily the sort of thing that's going to be. It wasn't necessary in my case, but my case is a weird case anyway. But still, I think that when it comes right down to it, it involves what you can do and not necessarily what your educational background is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing for people that are interested in getting into baseball or other sports for that matter is really understanding what front offices do, what skills are valued, and you know, when you're making a pitch to us, whether it's a cover letter or in person, you know, don't try to convince us that we need to hire an MBA. Convince us that you know what front offices do and you have that skill set. You know, and those aren't necessarily exactly the same thing. So, you know, a lot of people ask me what my job is like on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's a really important thing to understand. Like, what are the actual things that a front office is doing? How does that sort of match your skill set? How do you need to improve your skill set to make yourself a more versatile member of one of those teams?
Well, what do you think is the biggest misconception? I mean, because that's something that I hear all the time. Every time I talk to GMs, they always say, nobody really understands what it is that we do.
Right.
You think it's like, well, you go and you sit in your office and you make trades, and
Right,
you look at your team and say, this guy stinks, I'm sending him down. And
Yeah.
And what do you think is the biggest misconception? I mean, if somebody's trying to figure out, hey, I want to be able to demonstrate to you that I've got a grasp of what I'm going to be hoping to do in my life, what do you think is the biggest misconception?
Well, I think, you know, this idea that you're going to walk in and you know, be riffing with Billy Beane on sort of trade ideas on day one. I mean,
And then he
you know,
throws
We
a
all saw
chair.
the movie. I mean, you know.
I think the biggest misconception is that you can pitch yourself as, you know, essentially a really good fantasy baseball player, and you're going to bring that skill set. You know, I mean, that's sort of, you know, I've never won a fantasy baseball league. That may be a huge indictment on my qualifications, but
We have an opening, by the way.
And you have a great name, right?
that's not sort of, you know, I think it's got to, you've got to sort of understand more of the mechanics. I mean, it's not about, you know, do you think this was a good trade or bad trade? It's what goes into the evaluations of each player, how do we put the roster together. Sort of really understanding the nuts and bolts of the operation is more important than saying, hey, I have good judgment, so hire me and I'll tell you whether you're making good trades or bad trades.
We have a minute left. Can you please tell the Britpop story? Don't kill me. This
In a
is really
minute, huh?
interesting.
Well, you know, I get asked a lot about sort of how I came about getting this job, and you know, I just sent my resume in on a whim to a job posting. I didn't know Billy or David Forrest, the assistant GM, or anybody else in the front office. And in fact, I was in grad school. I wasn't in an active job search, and my resume was a little outdated. This was 2004, and I had last updated my resume in 1998 when I was graduating from college. And at the time, you know, Britpop was a huge phenomenon.
Meaning Britpop music.
Right, you know, Oasis, Blur, and all these
Blur,
bands,
yeah.
and you know, under interest, this was my attempt to be cute on my resume. I had Britpop as one of my hobbies, you know, and you know, what, like the second or third question Billy asked me when it, you know, it was totally surreal. I was a huge baseball fan, you know, just being in the same room as Billy was like overwhelming in a lot of ways, and you know, I think it was like the first or second question he asked me. He said, "So I see you have following Britpop on your resume under interest." And I went, "Oh my God, how did I not take that off my resume?" That was a huge, you know, and you know, I was getting ready to just pick up my bag and walk out of the room, and he said, "I'm the biggest Oasis fan in the world," and you know, and we spent about a good 20 minutes just talking about our favorite songs and the concerts we went to, and you know, he still tells people to this day that's how I got the job. So, you know your subject's music interest and have
Yes.
that in your interests on the resume. That's sort of my probably best advice.
That's awesome. Does anybody else have any final thoughts?
I think it's just clear that Noel and Liam are the new market inefficiency. Obviously, that's the case.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you guys all for listening. Great job, all of you.